My stepdad, he was on the run. He got this idea that we should be Amish, to isolate us. So he kept us on a mountain for years. Very, very abusive, sexual abuse, slavery.
On a remote mountain ranch, Misty and her sister Samantha weren't raised. They were controlled. Cut off from society, subject to brutal physical violence and unspeakable abuse. The two girls lived in near total isolation. Escape wasn't an option. Fear was constant, and rescue, well, that just felt impossible. Very few people even knew they existed, let alone cared enough to come looking. As teenagers, the sisters were adopted into Amish families. For the first time, hope flickered. Life seemed safer, kinder, almost normal, but the hope didn't last because for Misty Griffin, the nightmare didn't end when she left that mountain. It only changed form. The new nightmare came from an Amish bishop, a man that she felt she could trust. This is the true story of Misty Griffin and how she went from the abuse of a sadistic stepfather, then into the home of an evil bishop. Before we begin, welcome to the Murder She Shed. My name is Holly, and this is the place where all true crime nerds gather so they can listen to rarely heard true crime cases right from my little she shed. So if you'd like to join all of us true crime nerds, make sure you hit that subscribe button because you might not find this Southern girl again in this big YouTube world. This story is different. It's a survivor this time instead of a victim, so there is light at the end of the tunnel. Misty Griffin was born into an already fractured family. Her mother, Sue, was 17 years old at the time of Misty's birth and had become pregnant by her own stepfather. Sue was 9 years old when her stepfather started raping her. Misty was the second child born from an incestuous relationship. Some people don't believe this is incest, but to me, a stepdad who, they become your dad then. To me, even though it's not blood related, this is incest. It's still disturbing. It still makes you commit incest. In my book anyway. I don't know if legally that's true, but you're disgusting. That's all I can say. You're claimed to be that child's dad now. So you're just as bad as if it was a biological father to me. Her older brother had been born 2 years earlier when their mother was just 15 years old. So her mother was a very young mother. Less than 3 years after Misty was born, her younger sister Samantha followed. Eventually, the adults involved divorced, and Misty and her siblings went to live with their father, their biological father. But when Misty was 4 years old, her mother re-entered the picture, presenting custody paperwork and asserting her parental rights. Misty's mother, Sue, made a decisive choice, leaving her son with his father while she took her 2 daughters to live with her and her new boyfriend. And I'm sure this was partly Brian's decision because Brian, well, you'll find out he preferred little girls. In fact, when he first met Sue, he didn't know that she had children, and Sue didn't tell him for a long time. But as soon as he heard, his ears pricked up and he goes, "Oh, let's go get them." And of course, he chose the 2 little girls to take. Brian, the boyfriend, was 47 years old and according to records from years earlier, had been sought by authorities in connection with child molestation offenses in the 1970s. These charges involved a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old little girl. The sisters were taken to Brian's 13-foot trailer located in Bradshaw Mountains, Arizona, to live near a mine shaft since Brian was a minor. Life with Brian was a harsh and unrelenting reality for Misty and her sister. And no running water, no electricity. He believed in the strictest discipline and insisted that children were to be seen and never heard. Every day felt like a walk on a tightrope where one misstep could draw his sharp attention. Brian would not let the sisters talk to each other or other people until they raised their hands and asked for permission. He wouldn't even let the little girls, if they were working, one would have to work inside, one would have to work outside because he didn't want them speaking to each other at all. He liked to keep them isolated. That was part of his game, I guess. The little girls even made up their own special sign language to try to communicate with each other, like when they could get away with it without making any noise. It's sad they had nobody They were allowed to speak to no one. They just were made slaves, basically. Every tiny mistake, whether it's forgetting to close the door, drop a dish, not coming immediately when called, or talking without permission, would earn the girls a severe switching or belting. These punishments took place about 3 times a day for both of the little sisters. The worst part was that their mother would either participate in the punishment or stand by and watch. She basically loved to torture them too. She was just as sadistic. Remember, she didn't want them to begin with. Brian talked her into coming and getting the little girls, and she really didn't want much to do with them. And when they were out of line, she was just as mean as he could be. They were both horrible people. Brian not only tortured these little girls, he tortured animals too. He also told these little girls that he could chop their heads off, bury them under a tree, and no one would know or care. Misty also began getting essayed by Brian when she was only 4 years old. He would touch her on a daily basis until she was shipped off to the Amish community when she was 18. The following spring, Brian was unable to get any permits and he lost his mind. For the next 4 years, they traveled to Washington in the summer and back to Arizona in the winter. In Arizona, they would live in trailer parks, and when spring came, the family would pull up the stakes and drive to Washington, where they would alternate between trailer parks, the beach, and random truck stops. In the summertime, Brian would work construction jobs, and in the winter, he would work a few small mines he had in northern Arizona. Sue continued to collect government checks, one for herself, one for Samantha and Misty. During this time, Brian began reading books about the Amish. Brian started making Sue and the girls wear long dresses and tie white muslin dinner napkins around their heads so they could look like little Amish girls. I don't know if he had a thing about this or what. He began reading the Bible to the girls every morning before he left for work. Brian claimed that the Amish way of life was how God intended husband and wife to live, with children obeying women and women obeying men without government interference. Upon writing letters to several Amish communities, Brian was informed that since he and Sue were divorced, they would never be allowed to fully join any Amish community. Yet the Amish were willing to correspond with those interested in living a plain lifestyle, and Brian was directed to a bishop in Pennsylvania for guidance. The bishop's response was clear. He would not mentor Brian until the family fully conformed to the Amish dress code, because he didn't approve of what they were wearing, so he made them actually order clothes, dresses, head coverings, aprons, shirts, and trousers from a company that supplied clothes for plain people. In his mind, this was the path to belonging, and he pursued it with fervor. Brian basically became obsessed with the Amish lifestyle. He constantly admonished the girls, insisting that any print or decoration on their clothes was a sign of pride and moral weakness. Sue began taking sewing lessons, learning to make dresses and other garments, and in doing so, she became a tool in building the strict world Brian envisioned. That girls also had to learn how to sew and make their own things too. Slowly but surely, Sue and Brian were building an unbreakable barrier between their little family and the outsiders. And Brian knew it was a barrier few people would be willing to cross, making it safe for him to abuse the girls any way he wanted. One day, Brian came across an ad in the paper for some land across the Cascade Mountains in eastern Washington. They drove across the mountains to see it. The property was nestled on a mountainside 6 miles outside of a small town. It was the perfect isolation he would need in order to continue brainwashing and abusing his little family. After moving to the new land, they built a shack to live in, which included a loft area where the family would sleep. Brian and Sue slept on one mattress on one side of this loft, and the sisters slept on another mattress on the other side. Brian stared at the sisters while they undressed. They had no privacy at all. They had to undress in front of him up in that loft. And he was also dressed and undressed in the middle of the room, so there was no chance Misty and Samantha could miss it. The loft held a lot of bad memories for Misty. While Sue was reading a romance novel, Brian would call Misty to the loft for a massage. If she denied any advances he made on her, then she would severely be beaten the next day. And you know that as Sue was reading that romance novel, you absolutely know she knows what's going on up in that loft. And she doesn't care. She absolutely did not care. Like I said, she was evil as he is. They're just both evil people. Brian and Sue had a ritual where they would make the girls stand on a 5-gallon bucket, for an hour. before they would let them take a bath. And Brian would be staring at them and smiling. And it just made Misty feel so gross, And one time she even tried to get down and cover herself with sawdust because she just felt so exposed. And she got a spanking and a beating for covering herself with sawdust. She's made to wash it all off and get back up so he could stare at her again. Every time Misty would bend over, he would get behind her and press himself up against her. Just remember, she's a little girl. Just so disturbing. The children woke up before the adults. They were forced to make the adults breakfast. Then they would go outside hungry, take care of the animals that they bought at an auction. At this time, they had all kinds of animals. They had whatever you have on a farm, horse, cows, goats, pigs, chickens. They had everything. And they were forced to go outside and take care of them while the parents just laid around and did nothing. Sue was supposed to homeschool the girls since they were not allowed to go to school. But the only reason they did any schoolwork at all was just in case the state checked on them. So the girls knew how to read, at least. Misty kind of taught herself, so they knew how to read and write a little. Life in the new shack was tight, and Samantha and Misty were only allowed inside to sleep, cook, clean, and eat. Everything else was done under the giant cottonwood tree, which had a lean-to tarp, just a tarp nailed to it. And this was even in the wintertime. They had to use this tarp. They were only allowed to come inside during the day and do slave work. They could sleep inside at night, but all the rest of the time, these girls were forced to be outside under the lean-to or outside feeding the animals. And they'd get frostbite because the girls would get so cold in the wintertime. In fact, Misty actually got frostbite so bad that all 10 of her toes became infected and were bleeding. And her mom actually did take her to the doctor when that happened. The Amish shack and the clothes served its purpose, and no one seemed to question why Misty's toes were so badly frostbitten. Brian saw the girls as slaves, and in this picture I'm showing you, you can see the ownership he showed over the sisters by the way he's grabbing their arms. There were many weekends that Misty would be left alone with this creepy stepfather, while her sister and mom would go sell crafts they had made for extra money. During this time, Brian would take full advantage of his alone time with Misty. On Misty's 15th birthday, her mother announced that her older sister, known as Aunt Fanny, would be moving into the home. Fanny had significant mental disabilities, which Sue and Brian cited as the reason for taking her in. What was left unsaid was that her presence came with a monthly government payment of $550. Fanny did not speak. She rarely reacted. Most of the time, she just stared into space. Almost immediately, she was forced to conform to the same rigid rules as the rest of the household. Her clothes were replaced with plain garments, and Sue and Brian abruptly stopped all of her prescribed medication. Choices that ensured the money meant for her care remained untouched and only used by them. Despite her condition, Fanny was expected to work every day. Her time was divided between the girls, one day with Samantha, the next with Misty. Both girls tried whenever possible to protect her. She wasn't capable of understanding how to do the work, so the girls had to show her. That's why they assisted her. And the girls knew what happened if Fanny was seen resting, moving too freely, or failing to meet expectations, or talking to things in the corner that didn't exist. She was beaten by the mother. Sue would beat her probably worse than Brian would. Sue hated her sister. She despised her sister, and every wrong move, she would beat Fanny. And Misty and Samantha actually grew to really love Fanny. They became really attached to her. Felt like as a way of kind of getting them out of their isolations. They had somebody, when they would take her out with him. Not long after, Brian and Sue brought in a rundown trailer onto the property. This was so they could place Brian's mother, who suffered from Alzheimer's disease, inside that trailer. With her arrival, of course, came another check. Another source of income. And this helped because by this time, the girls were actually getting too old for her to get benefits from them. So this helped supply more income for them. And they were just as evil to her. She didn't even understand what was going on since she had Alzheimer's disease. They wouldn't give her medication correctly. In fact, the only one that took care of her was the girls. She was set in days with urine underneath her. She was just abused and neglected just like everybody else that they took in. When Misty was 18, she fought back when Brian attempted to spank her. He wanted her to bend over and he was going to hit her at 18 years old. This caused Brian to choke Misty because she wouldn't comply to what he wanted to do. And it's the first time that she had actually went against him. And she almost passed out. Their sister jumped on Brian's back, and the sheer force of her weight threw him off balance enough that he lost his grip on Misty's neck. So he then began beating Samantha. So Misty threatened Brian that she would tell the authorities. After she threatened him, she took off out the door. Misty did, and she started running down the road. Brian got in his truck. He started chasing her down the road and begging her to stop. It was like 6 miles before she would have even got to anybody to tell. And she got tired. Couldn't outrun him, so she just got back in the truck with him. Decided she'd go back.
When I saw the truck, I was like, they're going to catch me. I'm just making it worse if I keep going. Whatever punishment is waiting for me, I'm making it worse. So, my stepdad said, get in the truck, and I did. When I showed up back to the house, my sister was like, what do you do? Why did you keep running? I had learned you can make the punishment worse and worse and worse. And, I didn't know what was waiting for me at home. I thought they were probably going to tie me up or something. I was scared. I threw up next to the steps. I was so scared. My sister was at home. I knew it was going to make things worse for her if I didn't go back. So I went back. I thought maybe at least I can protect her. So I went back, and my stepdad called us in for a meeting. He said, everybody in the house. So we sat down, and he just sat there for a few minutes, tried to scare us.
I guess this scared Brian so bad that he told the girls that it was time to ship them off to an Amish community in Minnesota. I guess the same bishop he had been talking to. Usually outsiders were not accepted, but this Amish community made an exception because they claimed that they needed new bloodlines. That's kind of creepy. But I guess it's one of the strictest Amish communities in the United States. And at first, Misty thought this would be a good thing. She would finally get away from her abusive mother and stepfather. But basically, she just stepped from one nightmare into another one. At 18 years old, Misty moved in with her new Amish mother and father, Jacob and Lillian, and their 4 children. Everything about the Amish world was unfamiliar, and Misty had a lot to learn. But one thing the community noticed immediately, Misty was quiet, obedient, and an exceptionally hard worker. Traits that were praised by others but had been learned through years of fear and control under her stepfather. For the first time in a long time, Misty wasn't isolated. There were people around her, children, daily activities. She felt something close to happiness, and yet beneath it all, there was an unease she just couldn't shake. A constant sense that something was wrong, that something bad was waiting just out of sight. It didn't take long for Misty to notice a shift inside the home. Jacob, her Amish father, began paying her more attention that seemed inappropriate. At the same time, he grew increasingly critical of his wife. Lillian was corrected openly while Misty was spoken to kindly. Compliments were offered where discipline once stood. Soon Lillian turned her concern toward Misty. She got very jealous of Misty because her husband was paying Misty so much attention. And I think her husband just liked to be mean to her. And that was just a new form of him just being really cruel to his wife. Lillian accused Misty of pinning her dresses too tightly. The Amish people, or at least in this community, they didn't have zippers. And you'd use pins instead of zippers or buttons or whatever. So they just stuck pins through there. And so she said that she was pinning her dress up too tight. And that was drawing attention to herself. Misty stood out without trying to. She was thin with curves that set her apart in a community where most women were either slender and straight-figured or heavy-set. Something she could not change, yet something she was quietly blamed for. As a young Amish single woman, you're not supposed to bring any attention to yourself. Can't smile or even look up at a man. Even if a single lady tries not to bring attention to herself but still gets unwanted attention and it's noticed, well, the woman is blamed. Lillian had 13 miscarriages, and because of this, she had a hysterectomy at a young age. This caused Lillian to be jealous of Misty, who was at childbearing age. Also, her husband treated her badly, and I don't know if that was because she could only have 4 children. In the Amish community, they have lots of children, so 4 children might seem a lot to us, but it's really not a lot to them. And maybe he was just disappointed in his wife. And so he took it out on her, and he's really mean to her. Jacob and Lillian lived next door to the bishop, whose wife Phyllis had suffered a lifelong battle with seizures and a chronically dislocated shoulder. She had seizures once, sometimes twice a week. The couple had 6 small children, and because of Phyllis's disabilities, it made it hard for her to care for the children. So the bishop, Peter, asked if Misty could become his wife's maid. Misty had been hearing some rumors that bothered her, however. Within the community, troubling stories circulated quietly, never openly, never loudly. There were whispers about Bishop Peter, who was accused of making inappropriate advances toward an unmarried girl. There were also whispers that he liked to get with animals and little girls. And then there was Larry. Larry was not Amish. He had lived in the community years earlier, staying at one of the Amish families with children's property and helping with work around the farm. He was in his late 50s, and his past was not a mystery. Larry had served prison time for human trafficking and SA on minors. The community knew this, and still they chose forgiveness. They believed Larry deserved a fresh start, just as they had extended forgiveness to Amish church members who committed similar acts. They forgave him. Larry adopted Amish dress, worked the land, attended church, and participated in social gatherings, as if his past no longer mattered. One morning after most of the Amish family had left the house for chores, 14-year-old Laura stayed behind because she was sick. When her mother heard a noise upstairs, she rushed to investigate. What she found would never be spoken of openly again. Larry was in Laura's bed, and Laura was sitting upright in bed crying. No police were called. Instead, Laura and her family were told they must forgive Larry, just as they would forgive any man within the church. They were instructed not to speak about what had happened. In Amish belief, to discuss someone's wrongdoing is seen as proof that forgiveness was never meant. If Larry had been a baptized member of the church, he might have been shunned. But then they're welcomed back after they're shunned. That was the extent of discipline, even for serious offenses. But Larry was not Amish, and because of that, there was no formal punishment at all. Contacting law enforcement is always discouraged within the Amish community. A few weeks later, Larry disappeared. What remained was silence and blame. Some men within the community quietly shifted responsibility onto Laura, 14-year-old little girl that was sick in bed. Yet they claimed she had been too friendly. Misty learned through this that it was always the woman's fault, and coming from a stepfather who had SA'd her, she began to believe that this might be true. Because of the rumors going around about the bishop, Misty was careful never to be left alone in the room with Peter. The following spring, Misty's sister Samantha was allowed to live with the Amish. Samantha would be living with a different family in that community, so she wouldn't see her sister that much. But not long after Samantha arrived, her Amish family moved to Wisconsin to join an Amish group there, so the sisters were separated pretty quickly again. Once when Misty was telling the bishop's wife, Phyllis, what her family had done to her, Phyllis confided that her father, who had been a deacon, had SA'd her and all her siblings between the ages of 12 to 15, because that was the age he preferred. Phyllis said, once I found my sister who was about to be married with my father. They were both moaning. I don't think they saw me, but there has been gossip that her firstborn child is my father's. Those two still have a strange relationship to this day, she said. Phyllis said she was so glad to marry Peter and get out of her family's home. Basically, she went from one to another. Misty was asked if she could live with Phyllis and Peter as a maid for at least a year. I guess they had had a meeting and discussed how Jacob and Lillian were having problems in their marriage because of Misty being in the home. So Bishop was kind enough to ask her in his home to be a maid. I'm sure that's the only reason. Phyllis's seizures seemed to be getting worse, and many nights Peter would knock on Misty's bedroom door with a screaming baby in his arms. She started to sleep in her dress because Peter stared at her and pretended he did not mean to touch her as he passed Misty the baby. Eventually, Peter stopped knocking altogether. Instead, he'd just come into the room without warning and wake her up. And he would always tell Misty he did not want to wake the children by knocking, so that's the reason he didn't knock. And then he would stay there, standing over the bed and holding the baby and the lantern while she got out of bed. First couple of times he did it, Misty saw his eyes light up because he could see through her nightdress. And that was when Misty wised up and began to keep her dress on when she suspected that the baby would be really fussy during the night. Phyllis never seemed to notice Peter's behavior. And like many Amish girls, Misty said nothing. Phyllis's seizures began occurring with alarming frequency. At one point, she suffered episodes 3 days in a row. To an untrained eye, they might have appeared like a worsening medical condition, but something about them felt off. There was an uneasiness to the pattern, a sense that what was happening didn't fully add up. Without medical knowledge, there was no way to explain it, only a growing feeling that something wasn't quite right. The morning after one of those episodes, the family gathered at the breakfast table as usual. It was there without warning or context that Peter asked the children a question that instantly shifted the atmosphere. He wanted to know if they thought Misty would make a good mother if something were to happen to their own mother. It was a remark that lingered in the room long after it was spoken. It brought shivers down Misty's spine. By this point, Misty had a growing suspicion that Peter was giving Phyllis something other than the herbal remedies he claimed to be using. The thought lingered, troubling but unspoken. Later that evening, routine sounds filled the house. Peter returned through the back door with the milk buckets and went down into the basement to strain them, just as he always did. Minutes passed. Then he called out, asking for help. What followed was deeply unsettling. He called Misty down to the basement, and when she got down there, the basement was completely dark. Peter claimed the lantern had gone out and that the milk had spilled, saying you couldn't find the matches. Misty handed him some matches, and he lit the lamp. The front of Peter's pants were open, and he was completely exposed for Misty to see. Misty ran upstairs into her room. After that, Peter's behavior shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. He began placing himself in situations where boundaries were deliberately blurred, always when others were absent. There were moments when his clothing was intentionally left undone, moments clearly meant to shock and unsettle. Each incident felt calculated, as though he were testing how much he could get away with. At times he would position himself unexpectedly behind her while she worked, waiting to be noticed. Misty would turn around in his junk. Peter, exposed as Peter, I don't know how else to say it. It would be hanging out. He even walked in while Misty was taking a bath. She tried to cover herself the best that she could. Peter just stood there for several minutes grinning. On other occasions, he would stare at Misty's top area, pushing himself into her back or pretending to hug her when no one was around, and then he'd run his hands up and down her. In a world like this, coming forward was unthinkable. Even if she was believed, which felt unlikely, the blame would not fall where it belonged. It would be placed squarely on her. She was the woman. It was her fault. She knew with absolute certainty that the narrative would shift until she was seen as the instigator, the temptation, the problem. As time passed, there was no improvement in Phyllis's condition. If anything, the seizures became more predictable. They no longer felt random. It was a pattern beginning to form, one that was difficult to ignore. Again and again, Phyllis would suffer an episode roughly 30 minutes after Peter had been alone with her. The previous week, Peter had told Phyllis that he thought she was possessed, and that was what was causing her seizures. While she seized, Peter held the Bible in front of her and commanded that the devil come out of her. What made the moment even more disturbing was what Peter said next. Almost casually, he remarked that some people died during exorcisms. A few weeks later, Misty walked down to get something out of the basement, and she heard some noise. Peter was putting pins, remember the pins on the dress, back on his 12-year-old daughter's dress. He turned red knowing he had been caught and quickly walked back up the basement stairs. Misty knew right then that he was also testing his little daughters. The following morning after that happened, tension hung heavy in the house. Peter had closed the bedroom door while giving Phyllis her medicine, an act that immediately stood out. Like I said, in Amish household, secrecy is discouraged. Doors are rarely shut and never locked. A closed door was not normal. It was a warning. By this point, Misty's suspicions had hardened into near certainty. Timing of the seizures, Peter's involvement, the isolation, everything pointed in the same direction. Summoning courage, Misty opened the door. What was seen in that moment was chilling. Peter stood beside the bed, holding a glass of water to Phyllis's lips. The liquid in the glass was cloudy, and Peter's face was alarming. When he realized he was no longer alone, his face flushed a deep, unmistakable red. It was a look that Misty had seen before, a look of being caught. Peter froze, then he looked back, locking eyes, expression tight with guilt as he continued to hold Phyllis's head upright. Phyllis moaned softly, turning her head away, her body resisting even as he persisted. That night when Misty laid down to sleep, she cried herself to sleep from all that had happened. She was awoken by a true nightmare of Peter sticking his hand up her nightdress. Misty tried to pull away, but Peter grabbed her legs and pulled her to the end of the bed. At this moment, Misty became blank, almost like her mind just shut down, because the next thing she remembered was waking up with her legs apart at the end of the bed, and she felt sore all over. Peter entered her room the next morning and said, "Get ready, because I will be making nightly visits from now on." When Misty attempted to leave the house, Peter saw her leaving, grabbed her, and started attacking her and telling her not to tell anyone what had happened. He said the church would be on his side. He said that he had done this before with children and animals, but he was always forgiven by the church, and the girls were always blamed. He threatened to smother Misty in her sleep. Despite his aggression, Misty managed to break free. She ran to the horse stall where a man and woman temporarily caring for the horses that were not a part of the Amish community. They were just taking care of the horses at the stalls. And that couple urged her to go to the police and even drove her to the police station. But the moment she began speaking with an officer, she realized that trusting the system had been a mistake. The police seemed unwilling to believe that such horrors could occur within the Amish community. Officers did drive to Peter's home. Questions were asked, but nothing was done. Word quickly spread within the community that Misty had gone outside rather than handling matters internally. Fear and isolation closed in around her once more. She returned to the horses' stalls, scared and unsure what to do next. Peter, Phyllis, and her Amish parents soon found her, insisting she drop the charges. But Misty was no longer willing to remain silent, and she's worried about Peter's children being abused. She refused to carry the burden of shame and blame alone, to be yet another broken woman silenced by fear. In an act of defiance, she reached up and untied her head covering. Peter snapped a warning, threatening excommunication if she removed it. Misty let it fall to the ground and said calmly, "You will not have the pleasure of excommunicating me because I am excommunicating myself." In that moment, she reclaimed her voice and her courage, refusing to allow fear to control her any longer. They had told her that she would be going to hell for leaving the Amish community, and at that moment she had never felt more fear in her life, but also she felt so free. The couple that was caring for the horses took her home to their trailer until Misty was able to figure out what to do next. Misty remembered a woman from her childhood that always just seemed so kind. The woman was her stepdad's sister, Aunt Laura. The couple who saved her got on their computer and attempted to find Aunt Laura's phone number. Misty was actually amazed at everything you could do on a computer. She'd never seen one. But Misty did remember that Aunt Laura owned a furniture store near Seattle, and they called the number of the store, and her aunt agreed to let her stay at her house. The only problem is that Misty could not fly to Seattle because she had no form of ID. When Misty had joined the Amish community, they made her put her social security card in the stove and burn it. It was at this moment she knew that she must face Peter one more time. She had $1,000 that she's able to save and hide in her hope chest, which was at Peter's house. She was scared, but she knew it was the only way to get money to pay for the bus trip. The kind couple didn't make her do that. Instead, they went inside and retrieved the money with some argument from him, of course. But they were able to get the money back. Aunt Laura moved Misty into her home and paid her for working at the furniture store. Misty saved up money for college, but first she had to get her GED. She learned about daily showers and deodorant. She's used to one bath weekly and about 1.5 inches water. That's all they let you use. And she wasn't used to using soap because most of their soap was just for decoration. It was too expensive, they'd say. She learned to shave her legs and wear clothing, although she still chose to wear long dresses at first because she felt naked in anything else. Meanwhile, back at the Amish community, Peter and his family had packed, took all the money from the church purse, and left for Canada because the police felt he was hiding something and he got nervous, I guess. 11 years later, Misty learned Peter had tried to get citizenship in Canada. Canadian officials eventually discovered the family was in the country illegally. They were given a choice, be deported back to the United States or leave on their own. So they returned to the U.S., moving from Kentucky through nearby states, never staying long before settling on Peter's brother's farm. Later, they relocated again, and it was only then, after years of silence, that their 3 oldest girls finally found the courage to ask a non-Amish woman for help. What emerged was devastating. It came to light that Peter had been essaying, remember Katie, the little girl in the basement, since she was 4 years old. Within the church, the response was swift but meaningless. Peter was shunned for 6 weeks, and then he resumed his role as bishop. What became impossible to ignore was this: the entire church had known. Throughout the years he remained in leadership, the congregation watched his children sit beside him every Sunday. They saw them grow. They must have wondered, and still nothing changed. By the time the truth fully surfaced, it was clear that nearly all the children, now 11 in total, had been essayed, even the boys. Peter and Phyllis were both removed from the home. Katie, the oldest daughter, had become the foster parent of all the 8 children who were still under 18, and they actually weren't dressing as Amish or living as Amish any longer at that time. Peter ended up in prison. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Is now a registered sex offender. Phyllis lost custody of her children because she knew about the abuse. And Misty, while she worked overseas as a missionary, she met her husband there. She had a baby. She went to college, found a job before she released a book titled Tears of Silence, which is the book I used in order to tell her story today. And then in 2024, she started working on her master's in nursing. I also learned that Fanny passed away while she was still living with her mom and Brian. And Laura did try to get their mom back from Brian because, see, this was Laura and Brian's mom. But she was never able to get custody of her. Her sister Samantha was still in the Amish community. She actually married a man in the Amish community. They couldn't talk to each other very much, but I guess Samantha did write her letters. They couldn't talk because Misty had been shunned from the Amish community. If you would like to order her book, Tears of the Silence, that can be found on Amazon. And I actually read it off of my Kindle. If you don't want to see my wrinkles, you better start subscribing. That's all I can say. Because I don't want to be here at 80 and be like all wrinkled up and you're still trying to get my 100,000. So you guys better start subscribing. Well, I'm just going to let Simon and Max say bye to you. We're outside walking and I decided, hey, I forgot to add them on the end. So I'm just going to let them say bye now. Hold on. You going to say bye? Huh? You gonna say bye? Yeah. Do you love your subscribers? I know, you get awful excited. Do you think they should join us next time at the Murder She Shed? I know you do. I know. Well, tell them that you love them. Say, that's ugly, Simon. That's ugly. You shouldn't tell him no. Tell him bye. Okay, there he said bye.